Rules by Which a Great Empire May be Reduced to a Small One, written by Benjamin Franklin. When you hear the name Benjamin Franklin, the first thing that comes to mind might be his groundbreaking work with electricity or the invention of the bifocal. What you might not immediately think of, but what was a very important part of his career, was his active role in the American Revolution. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 17, 1706, and lived there until he was 17 years old when he moved to Philadelphia. He didn't stay there long, though, because a year later, in 1724, he moved to England for the first time. Ben Franklin worked in printing most of his life, starting when he was 12, apprenticing for his brother James. James founded one of the first newspapers in America called the New England Courant when Franklin was only 15, and he worked there under the pseudonym Silas Dogood. When he moved to Philadelphia, he worked in a couple printing presses, but he was not satisfied with the work he was doing there. He finally moved to London for the first time, working in a printing press there before moving back to Philadelphia 2 years later. There he became the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, where he wrote about current events and news in the colonies. He soon became very well respected as a scientist and writer. He moved back and forth between England and the colonies twice more after that during the time of the American Revolution, and he became an agent for several American colonies. After appearing before the Privy Council in England and being humiliated for supporting the American cause, he became a huge activist for the American Revolution. It was in 1773 when he wrote Rules by Which a Great Empire May be Reduced to a Small One to support the Revolution. This piece mainly discusses colonial views on British policies. While it is structured as a general discussion with general ideas, it is targeted to include all of the things that the British did that the colonies did not like. All of the points Franklin brings up contribute to Franklin's claim that large empires tend to crumble at the edges. The many details and points he brings up are there to show how many ways in which this crumbling and collapse can occur. The details he brings up are focused around several main ideas: taxes, rights, government officials, and military power. Taxation without representation was a big reason for the colonies to fight for their independence, so Franklin talks about taxes a lot. The quote, "In laying these taxes, never regard the heavy burdens those remote people already undergo in defending their own frontiers," illustrates much of the indignation and confusion the colonists had with British taxes. Not only did the colonists not have a say in taxes, they were also taxed without consideration of their personal situations. The royally appointed and universally hated tax collectors and governors also took no interest in the well-being of their people. In the quote, "Remote provinces must have governors and judges to represent the royal person and execute everywhere the delegated parts of his office and authority," Franklin shows that the royally elected officials cared more about their office and authority than their people. The hatred of the tax collectors manifested into things similar to what is illustrated in the painting. This particular painting is of some colonists tarring a tax collector. Tarring was used as revenge and to publicly humiliate the collectors. The quality of these royal officials is also called into question with quotes like, "Send from the capital a board of officers to superintend the collected, composed of the most indiscreet, ill-bred, and insolent you can find." It is evident that these people were not good people and that the colonists did not think very highly of them. The colonists had also tried to set up smaller, less influential governments in the colonies, but had problems with the British government doing things like those in the quote, "If the parliaments of your provinces should dare to claim rights or complain of your administration, order them to be harassed with repeated dissolutions." The colonists did not appreciate this, as they were only trying to help keep things orderly in the colonies by having an actual government in the colonies, but they apparently did not even have the right to organize themselves. They had to rely on a government thousands of miles away, or a governor more concerned with himself than anything else. The military is the last point he brings up details about. The colonists were very suspicious of the British armies, evident in quotes like, "Send armies into their country under the pretense of protecting the inhabitants." The Quartering Act contributed to this, as it allowed the British army to keep its troops in colonial homes. This made the colonists feel like the army members were there to watch them instead of protect them, and was a large reason the colonists wanted to be independent. So overall, Franklin uses a list organization, atypical for a persuasive piece, to bring up points and details about why the colonists hate the British, while making fun of the British government at the same time. The period of 1763 to when this piece was written in 1773 was a period of great change in the colonies. It all started with the end of the 7 Years' War, where the British had fought the French on the colonies' behalf. The British won, and several things happened. The British got total control of North America because the French were gone, but Britain was saddled with a large amount of debt from the war. They decided that since they had gone to war for the colonies should have to help pay the debt from the war. With George Grenville as the new Prime Minister in Britain, salutary neglect came to an end. The British cracked down on colonial smuggling and started enforcing their older acts, like the Navigation Acts, more than they had before the war. This angered the colonists, but that was not the only thing they were mad about. To limit conflict between Native Americans and colonists, the British passed the Proclamation of 1763, which prevented the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists did not like this because they wanted to be able to colonize the new lands that they had just fought for with their lives. This was part of the start of the conflict between colonists and the British. From then until the Revolution consisted of Britain passing various acts and taxes on the colonists. The first thing passed after the 7 Years' War was the Stamp Act, which was the first direct tax on colonists. As various other taxes were placed on other things like paint and tea, British Army members were sent to Boston to enforce these taxes and control the radicals in the city. Violence broke out in the form of the Boston Massacre, which later was commonly used by revolutionists to inflame anti-British passions. Other acts were passed to do things like limit colonial rights and were generally annoying the colonists. The Declaratory Act is a great example of an act that limited colonial rights. It basically said the British had the right to tax the colonists and there was nothing the colonists could do about it. All British citizens were supposed to have representation in Parliament, and since the colonists didn't, passing acts and taxes would be restricting their rights as British citizens. The Townsend Act imposed taxes on a lot of different things, like paint, tea, glass, and paper, which annoyed the colonists to no end. Even the Tea Act, which lowered tea prices, hurt the colonists because it put independent shippers, smugglers, and local shopkeepers out of the tea trade because their tea was more expensive than that of the East India Company. Although there were many royally appointed people in the colonies, they were mostly tax collectors who definitely were not helping the colonists, and the governors who were not there to help the colonists, as previously mentioned. This was really frustrating to the colonists, as the governor had a direct line to the king and could at least try to help them. The other colonies who did not have governors, like Massachusetts, could not reach the king as their own governments were limited. The best example of such a limitation would be the Massachusetts Government Act, but that did not come until later. They were still limited, as Franklin writes, if the parliaments of your provinces should dare to claim rights or complain of your administration, order them to be harassed with repeated dissolutions. The combination of all of these problems between the colonies and the British led to tension and outright dislike. Much of this was fueled by writing from the colonial leaders. A great example is Common Sense by Thomas Paine, although Ben Franklin, who wrote this piece, lived in Britain from 1764 to 1775. He was there as an agent for the colonies, and he was frequently writing to argue for the colonists. His writing was often reprinted in the colonies and became very popular. This piece is one that was originally written in Britain and reprinted in the colonies. Rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one was originally written in London in September of 1773. It was written for the British King, King George III, and the British Parliament. Benjamin Franklin wanted to convince them that what they were doing would only end up harming themselves. He also wrote this paper for anyone who has ruled or governed. Franklin says, I address myself to all ministers who have the management of extensive dominion, empires, which from their very greatness are become troublesome to govern because the multiplicity of their affairs leaves no time for fiddling. Franklin also writes this for all British citizens to spread the revolutionary cause and get more people on their side. The paper was republished later that year in Pennsylvania, so this piece was also written for colonists to fire them up and make them want to fight. There were two main events that led to Ben Franklin to write this piece. The first was the passing of the Tea Act on April 27, 1773. The Tea Act was very important for many reasons. It was sort of a tipping point for the colonists as it led to the Boston Tea Party, which was an important rebellion against the British. The Tea Act was also a tipping point because it, and the Boston Tea Party, led to the Intolerable Acts, which symbolized the beginning of when Britain started to get really annoyed with the colonists. Although this piece was published before the Intolerable Acts and the Boston Tea Party, the important part is that it was published during the time when tensions and conflicts between colonists and Britain started to get really bad. The piece also may have influenced the Boston Tea Party itself. It was published in the colonies a mere day before the Tea Party. This shows how high the tensions were at the time this piece was written. Franklin knew how high they were and decided that then was the perfect time to write this piece. It is possible that Franklin was trying to show the British why the tensions were so high and why the colonists were angry with the government. That could also be why it was written in such an indirect and mocking way. It makes fun of the British government to get attention, but is indirect enough that it wouldn't be ridiculed or labeled as treasonous. The second reason that led to Franklin to write this piece was his move to Britain to be a colonial agent. He traveled in 1764 to Britain and was still there when he wrote this piece in 1773. This was not the only piece he wrote there, although it was one of his most famous. He was constantly writing to local newspapers in London. He submitted various essays and persuasive pieces to share colonial views. He even went to speak before the Parliament and represented the American cause. Although he traveled to London years before writing this piece, it still led him to write it, and the piece would not exist if he had not made the journey. Ben Franklin wrote rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one, partially as a way to make fun of the British king and Parliament for their treatment of the American colonies. The paper consists of a list of rules to follow if one would want to make their great big empire worse. Every rule is some treatment or law that the king or Parliament has passed in the colonies. Let the parliaments flout their claims, reject their petitions, refuse even to suffer the reading of them, and treat the petitions with the utmost contempt. Nothing can have a better effect in protruding the alienated proposed, for though many can forgive injuries, none ever forgave contempt, Franklin said. Franklin is trying to convince the British monarchy that if they continue to treat the colonies like they do, they're going to lose America and their big empire will be made much smaller. He says, by carefully making and preserving such distinctions, you will, to keep to my simile of the cake, act like a wise gingerbread baker who, to facilitate a division, cuts his dough half through in those places where, when baked, he would have it broken to pieces. This paper was published in England and the colonies, so Franklin was trying to spread revolutionary ideas to British citizens so they would be made aware how colonists feel about this treatment and try to get them on their side, and try to rally more colonists to join the revolution. Franklin used a lot of analogies to get his point across, one notable one being comparing empires to cake. He writes, in the first place, gentlemen, you are to consider that a great empire, like a great cake, is most easily diminished at the edges. Turn your attention, therefore, to your remotest provinces, that as you get rid of them, the next may follow in order. He does this to set the dynamic for the rest of the passage as more playful and poking fun at certain empires. He also uses idea chunking throughout the whole article to bring focus to each grievance he addresses. For example, he separated paragraphs into topics like corruption in the British government and how colonists didn't have as many rights and privileges as British citizens did. He also uses intentional and vivid language to incite a reaction in the reader. He mostly uses long, complex sentences to keep the reader engaged. He often also uses italicization throughout the piece to emphasize certain points and words. An example of this is, quarter troops among them, who by their insolence may provoke the rising of mobs, and by their bullets and bayonets suppress them. By this means, like the husband who uses his wife ill from suspicion, you may in time convert your suspicions into realities. These choices all reinforce the tone of the article and help Franklin convince more people to associate more with the thought of revolution. Franklin appeals to the reader's sense of logic by showing how Britain's ruling tactics are wildly unfair to the colonies. In a bit of sincerity, he points out that the colonists would not have elected those officials if it was their choice, and they would be a lot more careful if elections were in their hands. He uses sarcasm to falsely inflate Britain's policies, but genuinely show how faulty they are. Like when he says, you are therefore to be careful who you recommend for these offices. If you can find prodigals who have ruined their fortunes, broken gamesters, or stock jobbers, these may do well as governors, for they will probably be rapacious and provoke the people by their extortions. Another example is when he jokes that it's only right that Britain deny the colonists reasonable requests because they would only make more unreasonable requests if enabled. He also appeals to the reader's sense of paranoia by making colonists doubt the leadership they'd been under, and he appeals to patriotism subtly by hinting that as their own country, the colonies could do a much better job than England. The overall tone is sarcastic, but as the article progresses, it gets more and more apparent. At the beginning, there are several moments of sincerity and encouragement to help get colonists on board for revolution. Once on board, he gets them fired up even more by using his methods of pointing out corruption jokingly. Franklin's attitude toward England the whole time is annoyed and tired of being under their rule. Many times he references grievances they have made to the government that have been ignored. For example, he says, to confirm these impressions and strike them deeper, whenever the injured come to the capital with complaints of maladministration, oppression, or injustice, punish such suitors with long delay, enormous expense, and a final judgment in favor of the oppressor. He often punches up towards the British government and uses his sarcasm to show how poorly the colonists really are being treated. He falsely congratulates Britain on all the horrible things that they'd done to the colonies. For example, he references how Britain took over control of the property and fortresses that the colonial militias had won as their own. This was a very effective tone for the article, as it shined a light on everything the government had done and prepared colonists for revolution.